Okay, let's see how this format works for class this evening. Um, my apologies for having to cancel class. I really hate to do that, especially given the importance of this information and the limited time in which we have to explore it. But I think this will work for this evening. I'm going to go over some of the basics of the Wiatt 3. And I'm also going to probably record another podcast and talk to you about an activity that I want you to do outside of class and be ready to perform when you come to class next week. Um, okay, so let's start by talking about the Wiatt. The Wiatt stands for the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test. Um, at least I think that's what it stands for. Regardless, this is Wechsler's broad academic achievement test. It is directly comparable to the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, the WISC, which is a commonly used test of cognitive abilities. Um, okay, this is a broad achievement test. It has lots of subtests that look across students' performance across different domains: math, reading, writing, oral language. So let's kind of dive in and see if we can get a sense of the Wechsler. Okay, so the Wechsler recommends that you position yourself in such a way so that you can see the materials that the student is accessing. In most of the subtests, there are some materials for the student to utilize. That could be a stimulus book that you flip through and present different pictures to the student. It could be a response booklet that the student records answers to, or answers on rather. So there will be materials that the student is interacting with. And I think it works better to position yourself so that you can look at those materials in the same orientation that the student looks at it. So if you sit directly across from the student, you might have to look at some of the materials upside down or something like that. So I think it's better to position it this way. Um, Clearly, the important thing is that you conduct the testing in an environment where the student is used to performing academic tasks. So this, I know a lot of people will be like, oh, we'll go down to this quiet hall or quiet room rather at the end of the hall, and I will just go ahead and give this test to the student in a completely new but quiet environment. And my advice would be to try to find an environment that is quiet and free of distractions, but one in which the student is used to performing academic tasks. Because we know that some students have difficulty with generalization. They might have difficulty performing certain activities in an area that is new to them or in an area where they haven't performed those activities before. So just something to keep in mind. Know your students, know which environment that they receive a good deal of their academic instruction in, and try to administer the assessment in a similar environment. Um, Another thing to keep in mind, you of course could also make sure that students are able to stay engaged with the assessment. And so if you need to provide specific supports related to engagement, I think that would be appropriate. You would need to document that in your discussion of the test results. But I think it's okay to provide reinforcement, to use visual supports, to use task analysis um, in order to make sure that students can stay engaged with the test. Again, we know that academic achievement tests, standardized achievement tests, tend to have a lot of weight in determining services or placement for students. And we also know that they have a lot of flaws. And so we want to make sure that we're giving the students the best opportunity that they have to show what they know and to make sure that each student um, can be successful and that we can get an accurate snapshot of their performance. Okay, so consider the environment is what I'm saying. Okay, when you sit down to administer the Wiatt, you will have a scoring protocol in front of you in which you will be scoring the students' responses. At top of that protocol will be some information for you about that specific subtest. And each one of these pictures relate to relevant administration information about that specific subtest. So you have this is the, I don't know if you could see my mouse or not, so I'm going to act like you can't. But across the top, you could see these different images. There's materials, start points, stop points, item set reverse rule, timing, repetitions, and recording and scoring. So each one of these will provide specific information for that subtest. So let's start with materials. In this example, it's saying that you will need a stimulus book. Okay, the stimulus book has pictures, and it has um, questions that you might be asking the student presented visually. Okay. You might also have the response booklet where the student is actually writing their answers. So there's lots of different materials that are part of the Wiatt, and they will tell you exactly which materials go with that subtest um, on each subtest scoring sheet. Okay, it'll also tell you where to start and where to stop. So in this example, you see that students who are in the fourth grade start on item 25, and fourth grade students stop after item 45. So those are the general start points and stop points. So then we can also see the item set reverse rule. The item set reverse rule can be different for different subtests, and it'll tell you what that reverse rule is. But basically, the sort of essence of it is that we want students to get the first few items correct. Usually it's the first 3 items correct from the start point. If they don't get those items correct from the start point, then there's a set of reverse rules that take effect. And so then we're going to start administering the items before the start point in reverse order until the students get 3 in a row. Okay, we're going to revisit that with some examples here in a little bit, but there are some reverse rules, and some subtests have reverse rules that are specific to that subtest and don't follow the standard reverse rule. So you'll just need to check for the subtest that you're administering, what is the reverse rule? If there's any specific timing information, some of the subtests are timed. The fluency subtests are timed. I believe one of the writing subtests is timed. So some of these subtests are timed, and if that subtest that you're administering is timed, then it'll give you specific timing information there. Also, there's information on what prompts can you repeat to students and how often can you repeat them, and some specific scoring criteria for that subtest. So you would circle 1 or 2 point responses or 0 point responses based on specific criteria. Okay, so the top of every subtest scoring sheet will have this information for you. The other thing that you need to do right when you sit down to administer the assessment or report is to calculate the student's chronological age on the day that the test was given. Okay, and you want to be specific about this. You want to record this information. Um, you want to calculate this information down to the year, month, and day. Okay, and that level of specificity will then allow you to look up that student's scores in relation to other students their same age who took that test. So you do have to calculate the student's chronological age on the day of the test. So you simply do that by recording the test date and subtracting the birth date. Okay, there are several subtests within the Wiatt 3. Okay, you can see those subtests listed there on the left. And you can also see the specific composite scores that are derived from those subtests. So composite scores are kind of a grouping of scores around larger domain areas, whereas the subtests are around specific targeted academic outcomes. So the oral language composite consists of listening comprehension and oral expression. So you can see how the other subtests contribute to different composite scores. There's one subtest that doesn't contribute at all to any composite score, and that's the early reading skills subtest. So here are all the subtests. Again, I'm not sure if you could see my mouse. So we'll just start by talking about the subtests that start with listening comprehension and go all the way down through math fluency and multiplication. Okay, so you can see all the subtests there, and then you can see the subtest standard scores. Okay, those standard scores were arrived at by administering the subtest, identifying how many correct items the student responded to, adding up those correct items to get the raw score for that subtest, looking up the raw score of that subtest in the normed reference guide for the student's chronological age, and being presented with a standard score which indicates how well that student did relative to other students their same age who took the test. Okay, so we know that this test has a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15, so we can immediately look across the subtests and see areas of particular strengths and weakness. For example, sentence composition, the student scored a 77. Okay, we know that is more than one standard deviation below the mean. In fact, that's about 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. So we know that that's an area of particular concern for that student. Whereas math fluency and multiplication and listening comprehension are both more than one standard deviation above the mean. Those are areas of strength for the student. You can also see scores like reading comprehension, math fluency and subtraction, and oral expression, which approach that one standard deviation above the mean threshold. So pretty much the student did, average to above average on this test, with the exception of sentence composition, which was below average. Okay. Now transitioning down to the bottom. Well, actually, let's look directly across from the subtest header and see the different composites listed. So we looked at the composites on the last page. Here they are again: oral language, total reading, basic reading, reading comprehension and fluency, written expression, mathematics, and math fluency. Okay, and you could see then the standard scores which contribute to those to those composites. Sorry, I got a little painkiller brain going on. Okay, so what was I saying? Okay, so reading comprehension, for example, contributes to more than one composite score. That's why you see this 112 listed twice, because it contributes both to the total reading composite and to the reading comprehension and fluency composite. Okay, so just something to keep in mind, that we can see the composite scores here. Okay, now the other thing that we can do with the scoring summary is we can sum the composite standard scores to actually get a standard score for that composite. So if we look right here in the first one, oral language composite, we see listening comprehension of 117 and oral expression of 113. If we add those two together, we get 230. That's the sum of the subtest standard scores. We can then take that 230, we can look it up in our normed reference guide based on that student's chronological age, and we can get a standard score for that composite. So in oral language, the standard score for that composite was 117, indicating that this student is performing above average in oral language skills. Okay. We can look across those different composite standard scores and see that the two areas of weakness for this student are written expression and basic reading, with standard scores of 87 and 89, still within the average range, but approaching one standard deviation below the mean, so definitely in that low average range of performance. All the others are either above average or well within the average range, so we wouldn't be concerned so much about those. Okay. You can also look down under the composite standard score. The next line is confidence intervals. We talked briefly about confidence intervals last week. So with confidence intervals, we're essentially asking ourselves, how sure are we that the student's actual score falls somewhere within this range? So we're 95% confident that the student's score, composite score in oral language, falls between 109 and 125. Okay, so plus or minus 8 points from that actual standard score, composite standard score, we're 95% sure that the student's actual score is somewhere within that range. Okay, so I like to report on confidence intervals because it's essentially admitting that we realize that this is a flawed measure and that we can't be 100% sure that the score that we obtained on this day is an exact replication of that student's abilities. Okay, you can also look down at the percentile ranks below the confidence interval, and for oral language, with this composite standard score of 117, that student was in the 87th percentile, indicating that they performed the same or better than 87% of the students who took that test. A good indicator, um, a good indicator that they performed well on that subtest. Okay, we know that anything be above the 68th percentile is considered to be above average. Okay, if we think of our normal curve distribution, and 68% of our scores fall within one standard deviation above or below the mean. Okay, so something just to keep in mind. Let's see, where else can we look at here? Oh, let's go over to the total achievement, the very far right column. Okay, um, we can look at the different scores, or subtests rather, that contribute to the total achievement score, which is a way to collapse all the subtests to give us an indicator of the student's overall achievement level. Okay, so listening comprehension contributes to that, reading comprehension, math problem solving, sentence composition, word reading, essay composition, pseudo word decoding, numerical operations, oral expression, and oral reading fluency all contribute to that total achievement score. So essentially, we just add up all of those standard scores, and just like the composite scores summary, we get a sum of subtest standard scores, which for this student was 1016. We can then take that and look it up in the normed reference section for the total achievement relative to that student's chronological age, and we can come up with a standard score, a total achievement standard score, which for this student is 101, indicating that their total achievement is pretty much right at average. We could see that their percentile rank was 53%, indicating that they scored the same or better than 53% of the students who took this test. So just slightly above the mean for this student in terms of their total achievement, which again is just an indicator of their total achievement and is a way to kind of collapse all of those subtest results. Okay, so the last few things I want to talk to you about is applying the standard reversal rule. Okay, so the standard reversal rule, it really is related to all the basal and ceiling requirements for students when they're taking the Wiatt. Okay, so the first thing that you would do is you would start at the item that is appropriate for that student's grade level. Okay, so you would find that information at the top of the subtest, and it would tell you if the student is in the 4th grade, then I want you to start here. Okay, so in this example, you could see the coded number 1 that the student was supposed to start at item 16. Okay, and they got item 16 correctly, and they went on to item 17, and they scored item 17 incorrectly. Okay, so the standard reversal rule for the Wiatt is that they need to score 3 consecutive correct responses after the grade appropriate start point. So in order for this student to continue on without applying the reversal rule, they would need to get 16, 17, and 18 correct. Okay? They didn't, so we start administering the subtest, or we start administering the numbers in reverse order. Okay, so we would start with 15, the one right before the age or grade appropriate start point. And then we would continue backwards from 15 until the student got 3 in a row. Okay, so you can see for this student that they did not get 3 in a row until items 11, 12, and 13. So we continued to reverse backwards until they got 3 in a row. Okay, once they get 3 in a row, we are going to give them credit for everything above there. Okay, so 1 through 10, they get credit for. We're going to say they got those correct. Okay, so you just need to figure out where is that threshold of 3 in a row for the student, and we're going to administer items in reverse order from their grade point. Okay? Then once they get 3 in a row, you would skip down to the next administered item, which would be item 18. Okay? And you would continue to administer from item 18, okay, until the stop point, okay, which is identified for this student. Okay. Now there's also some rules about if you should stop before the stop point. Okay, and if they score 0 points across any 4 items, then you would stop the administering of this test and it will be discontinued. Okay. So this student got 18 right, but then they missed 19, 20, 21, and 22. So they scored 0 points across 4 consecutive items, and so we're going to discontinue the test. So then this student's raw score we would add up by giving them credit of 1 through 10, giving them credit for 11, 12, and 13. Okay, so that's 13. We give them credit for 15 and 16. So that's now 15, raw score of 15. And we'll also give them credit for 18. So their raw score would be 16. We would then go and look up that raw score in the normed reference section. And we would look it up relative to the student's chronological age when they took the test. And then we would report the standard score for that subtest. Okay? So that's the standard reverse rule. It's not the only reverse rule. Some subtests have specific reverse rules. The other thing that you could do is awarding credit for items preceding the grade appropriate start point. Now we know that some students are just going to do poorly in certain areas, and we already know that, and we don't have to start at their age or grade appropriate start point and let them miss 3 in a row or not score 3 correctly before we start reversing. Okay, you could start with an earlier item. Okay, you could start at a grade level prior if you know that that student doesn't generally perform well in this area. So for this example, you can see number 1, the coded number 1. The examiner begins with item 1 instead of item 7, which is the grade appropriate start point, because the student's classroom performance is well below grade level expectations in the area of spelling. Okay, and so they got 1, 2, and 3 right. However, they missed 4 and 5. Okay, but they do correctly respond to 7, 8, and 9. Okay, so that is the 3. That is the rule of getting 3 correct in a row. So wherever their highest level of 3 correct in a row, we're going to give them credit for everything above that. Okay, so if we go in and we say this student should be starting at item 19, but I know they really have trouble with this, so I'm going to start them at item 5, and I'm going to administer forward until they meet the discontinuation rule. You give them credit for everything above their highest level of 3 in a row. Okay, so if you administered 5 and 6 and 7, and they missed 1 and got 1 and missed 1, and you keep going, and they eventually get 7, 8, and 9 correct, then you would give them credit from 1 through 5. Okay, so this is to say you don't have to start at their grade start point if you know they have problems. If you start them earlier, then you would give them credit for their lowest or the highest number of 3 correct in a row. You'd give them credit of everything before that. So I'm sure that is not clear. As I'm saying these words out loud, I'm confusing myself. But look through these materials. We'll talk more about it in class. Really, it's about giving students as much credit as we can within the parameters of the test. Yeah, so that is a really quick overview of the Wiatt. It's imperfect in a lot of ways. I really regret that we have to do it in this format. But we'll reconvene next week and go over some more of the finer details, as well as giving you an opportunity to administer some of the subtests. Now, there are some activities that I want you to do outside of class this weekend to familiarize yourself with the different components of the Wiatt. And then we will revisit those at the very beginning of class next week. So please watch the other podcast that's related to your assignment and spend some time on that activity assignment throughout this week. So we're really ready to go talking about the Woodcock Johnson next week. I hope you all have a great week. Thanks for being flexible. It's much appreciated, and I will be in touch soon. Take care.